Good morning, boys and girls. This is Father Mark Pierce here. Back today, we're going to record. I shouldn't say record, tape, because it's not tape. We're going to record the lectures for May. Actually, last time I was supposed to lecture 4 hours for the April class day and 5 for May, but I went over and did 5 last time, so there'll only be 4 today. I got a few comments that the board was kind of hard to read because I've got bad penmanship, but particularly when I use light colored markers. So I've gotten rid of the orange markers. Secondly, I was told again it was a little far away, so we've moved the camera a little forward. I was also told that some of the lectures seemed to end abruptly, that maybe some of the last few seconds or whatever, I hope it was more than just a few seconds, got cut off. So we'll double check that. But good to have you here again today. I have you for 4 hours. We're a little bit behind on the agenda, but that's not going to be a problem at all. We're picking up with reading Mark. As I said last time, Mark's Gospel, I'm going to close the door here, be right back. Mark's Gospel is almost by everybody seen as the first written gospel that has survived. There might have been other efforts that got lost. There might have been surely other written pieces, fragments, collections that have been incorporated in the Gospels, but Mark, we think, is the earliest surviving gospel. And in some ways, Mark was the source, in my mind, he was the source that Matthew and Luke used. And we're going to spend a lot of time on Mark, because it's the first, because it's the briefest, frankly. Then I'm going to just summarize what Matthew did with Mark and what Luke did with Mark. I'll speak more about, in a general sense, how they handled the same material and what they added, and how their Gospels are different, though all three together are the synoptics. Remember again, optic, see, syn altogether, synoptic, all three tell the same story. Then we're going to spend a little more time than I'm doing on Luke and Matthew on John. John is something quite extraordinary and different. And then we'll spend a little bit of time with the book of Revelation, and that will be the day, okay? So we broke off last time after the parables. Again, very briefly, let me remind you what we saw with Mark. Mark is not a biographer in the sense that he gives us all the details of Jesus' life and person, things we would love to know about Jesus' upbringing, his hair color, his eye color, those things that are part of a modern biography are not Mark's concern. Mark, above all, is an evangelist. He's a teller, preacher, witness to good news. And so he's not going to give us all that biographical data that's maybe important to us. It's while the Gospels are biographical, they're not modern complete biographies in that sense. Mark began with the witness of John the Baptist, remember? He showed a little looseness in his quoting from the Bible. He says from Isaiah, when it's really a combined quote of Isaiah and Malachi and a little bit of Exodus. The scene at Jesus' baptism is the initial scene. And then after calling the initial disciples, and they drop everything to follow him, Mark follows Jesus' opening proclamation of the kingdom. Then we have a typical day. Then we have in chapter 2 through chapter 3, verse 6, we have a series of controversy stories. In chapter 3, what follows, Jesus calls his disciples, the 12, apart from the large crowd. We get the first example of a frame process that Mark will use. We'll see more of that, a lot more of that today. And then Mark gathers together all the parables, all but one of the parables that he's going to present, all fall in chapter 4. So the board is filled with things. We'll talk about what that is a little bit later. I hope you can read my hieroglyphics. We're in chapter 4, verse 35. Mark presents 3 mighty works you might say 4, because the middle one is made up of 2. 3 mighty works that again show Jesus with that authority that he showed that his initial presentation in the synagogue at Capernaum. Chapter 4, verse 35 is the scene of Jesus stilling the storm. The disciples are in the boat and a great storm comes up and Jesus is sleeping in the back. Verse 38, he was in the stern asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said, "Teacher, do you not care if we perish?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Jesus has, in a sense, exorcised the sea. He brought calm to it, like he cast out the demon in the synagogue. He cast out the force of chaos that the Hebrews associated with water, going back to Genesis 1. Remember, the opening scene of the Bible is that there is formlessness and void and water, and God says, "Let there be light," and God says, "Let the dry land appear." And so God puts order into watery chaos. Jesus does the same in the gospel. In verse 40, he turns on his disciples and says, "Why are you afraid? Have you no faith?" Now, these are the same guys who, at least 4 of them, when Jesus walked up to them, they are fishermen, remember? He walked up to them by the seashore. They dropped everything to follow him. And they seemed so strong. Well, we're getting another sense. This is one of the key, from here on out, you're going to see over and over again, the disciples aren't quite as bold and brave as they might have appeared at first. Verse 41, they were filled with awe and said to one another, "Who then is this that even wind and sea obey him?" Okay, so again, they are puzzled by Jesus' power to control the sea, just like God controls the chaos of Genesis 1. It says in chapter 5, verse 1, now this assumes you know your geography and maybe a map of, up at the end of your Bibles, there's a map of Bible lands, of Israel. It says, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. I'm going to draw a very crude little map here. Here is the Mediterranean coast. Okay, that's water. Here is the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. And up here is Galilee. Down here is Judea. Here is where Jerusalem, the capital, is. But this is the territory where Jesus' ministry generally takes place. Except it says he crosses over. So when Jesus, Capernaum's on this side, when he crosses over, Jesus is in the Gentile territory. Okay? Jews live on this side of the River Jordan, Gentiles on that side. All right, Jews here. So it pays attention, it will pay you should pay attention to what side of the river, what side of the sea Jesus is. He's crossing over to the region of the Gentiles. And here there's a very lengthy, Mark loves this story, evidently. He gives 20 verses to it about a man who's possessed by a demon. He's so possessed that he's chained, and when Jesus asks for his name, he says, we are legion, like the unit of the military, the Roman military, because there are many of us. Look at verse 7. The demon cries out of the Gentile, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Again, notice the demons know who Jesus is. The demon at the Capernaum synagogue said, "We know who you are." Well, here again. And then Jesus casts the demon out. He sends the demons into a herd of pigs that run off into the sea and drown. Look at the end of the story, verse 18. And he was getting into the boat, that's Jesus. The man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him, which is a definition of a disciple. Back in chapter 3, verse 14, Jesus chooses the 12 who will be with him. So the Gentile man, Legion, wants to be with him. And Jesus says, no, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you. Jesus means the Lord. I think he means the Father. Huh? And verse 20, it says, he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. So the narrator, Mark, is, even though it seems that Legion has made a bit of a mistake, Jesus was directing the man to praise the Father. The man is spot on in praising Jesus. And so the narrator identifies Jesus with the Lord. That word Decapolis, that's what this region over here, this is Galilee, this is the Decapolis, it means the 10 cities. Series of cities that were populated by Gentiles. All right. Then Jesus gets off the boat, so he's back on the Jewish side, and we figured that out because a Jairus, synagogue official, comes and says, my daughter is sick, come and heal her lest she die. And Jesus says, sure, and the crowd travels with. Okay, that's verses 21 through 24. On the way, there's another little incident. So here we have one of those, and maybe a fine example of Mark's building a frame and putting a story or a picture in the picture. So here's Jairus, and here's Jairus and his daughter, and here is the woman, the elderly woman. So we're reading it this way, we get one story, then the other, and they're linked together. Mark is trying to teach us how to read his gospel. So this is the woman who has, for 12 years, had, Mark delicately says, suffered from a hemorrhage. What he's talking about is her period, her monthly period, is ongoing. I cannot even imagine what that's like. Those of you women, and those of you who are married, have some sense of that. Married men have some sense of that, and you see your wives challenged with that. I spoke about blood when we read the Old Testament. Looked at Leviticus. We looked at that the idea about blood flowing makes you ritually unclean. So this woman should be at her home. Should be a hermit. Should be bound to stay at home the whole time. I think I acted it out with you back in whenever, December or March. When she leaves her home and picks through the crowd, every person she brushes up against, she's making unclean. That's why she wants to do it so quietly. Not because she's so humble, but because she does not want to draw attention, because she shouldn't be there. Look at verse 28. She said, if I touch even his garments, I shall be made well. And so she doesn't address Jesus, she just touches him, and she is made well. Jesus senses it, he turns around and asks, who touched my garments? And the woman's going, no, please don't address me. But Jesus says to her, when he senses what's going on, he says in verse 34, daughter, your faith has made you well. Daughter, what a lovely, he wasn't angry. Who are you to touch me? Or who are you to take my power away from me? No, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Then the story continues, and they arrive at Jairus' house, and the girl has died in the meantime. And Jesus raises her up. Look at verse 41. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. Interesting. The New Testament is written in Greek. The Gospel is written in Greek. But Mark, for some reason, felt it was important to remember the words that Jesus used at that moment in its original Aramaic. There's a handful of times in Mark's Gospel that Jesus does that. And I think that's really kind of stunning. So, Talitha kumi, little girl, get up. And then, verse 42, immediately the girl got up and walked. Remember, we talked about the necessary elements of a healing story is the sick person has to show they're better. So by her getting up and walking around, she shows that. All right? And Jesus at the end says, give her something to eat. No. So what links these stories together? Well, Jesus, their healing. How old is the girl who was raised from the dead? 12 years. How long was the woman suffering from her hemorrhage? 12 years. When Jairus arrives with Jesus at his house, when the crowd tells Jairus, your daughter is dead, he kind of cries out. Jesus, verse 36 says, do not fear, only believe. That sense of the importance of faith also connects. Jesus says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Jesus urges Jairus only to have faith, just to believe. So you see how the two stories are bound together by Mark. Now, they could have actually happened exactly like that. I mean, one incident and then on the way another. But Mark has given us literary connections. He's trying to teach us how to read his gospel. Okay? So there are 3 episodes that show Jesus' power, his ability to still the storm. Jesus is throwing out the demons that possess the man Legion. Jesus here able to heal both the woman and bring back the girl from the dead. Chapter 6, Jesus goes home and they're perplexed by him. But look at what follows. Chapter 6, verse 7. He called to him the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over unclean spirits. He charged them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, but to wear sandals and not put on 2 tunics. Jesus sends out his disciples 2 by 2. This is another window. Okay? So Jesus sends out the disciples 2 by 2. They're going to come back. When do they come back? Later in chapter 6. Verse 30, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all they had done. So, chapter 6, verses 7 through 13, and then verse 30. So they go out, they come back. What falls in between is the story of the beheading of John the Baptist. It's plunked down right there. What's Mark's? I'm not going to read it. You know the story. What's Mark's point? John the Baptist proclaimed the kingdom of God, and he loses his head. Jesus proclaims the kingdom of God, and we know what's going to happen to him, don't we, at the end? He's going to be crucified. The disciples are sent out 2 by 2 with his authority, and how do you suppose they're going to be treated? Mark is laying a foundation that to be in Jesus' company is not necessarily going to lead to sunshine and roses. There's going to be challenges involved. Okay? So when the disciples come back, chapter 6, verse 30-31, we have a series of events. They're outlined here in my scribbles. I'll read what's here. And then you see there are 2 columns of chapters and verses. There are 2 feeding stories in Mark. Twice does Jesus and the disciples cross the sea again. There's a dialogue with or concerning the Pharisees. There's a discourse or comment on food and defilement, and there's a pair of healings. So each of these, so here are the 2 feedings, chapter 6, 31, chapter 8, verse 1. So Jesus and Mark tells this tale once, and then Mark will tell the tale again. Jesus does the same series of things a second time. Let's go through it once, and then we'll just point out the highlights of the second time, and then say, well, why? Why this? This first story is, of course, the feeding of the multitudes. You have heard or read about preachers or commentators who make this story into a miracle of hospitality and generosity. Now, sharing is really nice. Sharing is a quality that disciples of Jesus should be involved in. But that's not at all what Mark is about. We have seen Jesus raise a little girl from the dead and cast out demons. When Mark says that Jesus took a few loaves and fish, and he blessed them and broke them and gave them to his disciples, he's not thinking of the story that you maybe heard somebody say that, oh, when they saw Jesus hand out the loaves, everybody had their own little packages of cheese and meat, and they began to share them. No. That's not at all what Mark is trying to present. And there's plenty left over in verse 43. 12 baskets full of broken pieces of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Verse 45. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida. So Jesus has crossed over, and he goes up the mountain and prays. And the disciples, meanwhile, after the feeding, they get in their boat and they travel again. And they have difficulty because they're rowing against the wind. Verse 48, Jesus walks on the water, meaning to pass by them. I hope you remember back when we read Exodus chapter 33, after the story of the golden calf, Moses says, Lord, I want to see your face. And Yahweh says, you can't see my face, you can see my back. I'm going to put my hand over the cave, you be in the cave, and then I'll walk past and pull my hand away, you can only see my back. Mark is consciously imitating that text, that Jesus walking on the water, and we talked about how the Jews thought of the ocean and of the sea as a somewhat frightening thing, and he means to pass by them. Now that seems a very strange detail until you remember Exodus. Mark is saying that Jesus again is the very power of God. They think it's a ghost and they cry out, and he says, take heart, it is I, have no fear. Verse 51. And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. This is the first time since chapter 4, remember, between the parable of the sower and the explanation, when the disciples asked for an explanation, Jesus kind of goes off about how they have hearts but do not hear, they have ears but do not hear, eyes but do not see, their hearts are hardened. Well, the narrator uses that same language now about the disciples and their misunderstanding. But all of this has to do with the crossing. Okay? Then, the next incident in chapter 7, when the Pharisees gathered together to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands defiled, that is, unwashed. This washing of hands is not the washing that we're also busy about in this era of the coronavirus. Not a washing for hygiene, it's washing for prayer. Before you eat, water is poured over your hands, and there's a kind of a blessing prayer that is said by the pious Pharisee. Jesus evidently, or his disciples, do not partake in this. And so the Pharisees ask why. Notice in verse 3, there's a parenthetical remark. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands, observing the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they purify themselves, and there are many other traditions which they observe, the washing of cups and pots and vessels of bronze. So notice, Mark, don't worry, I'm not going to keel over. Mark is explaining the ritual practices of the Jews. He feels he needs to do that. The Jews do this, he says, which should clue you in. Mark has an audience in mind who is not all Jewish, maybe predominantly not Jewish. Remember back in chapter 1 when he kind of loosely quoted Isaiah in describing John the Baptist? Mark knows his Old Testament. Mark himself has Jewish roots, I would propose to you, but his audience is one that doesn't understand all of this. And so Mark has to explain it. Notice that. So we learn, I think, from this and other texts that Mark has a primarily Gentile audience in mind. Jesus goes on, though, to talk about this cleanness and how it's silly. You worry about the outside, he says, but you fail to worry about the inside. Skip down to verse 14. He called the people to him again and said, "Hear me, all of you. Understand, there is nothing outside a man which by going into him can defile. But the things which come out of a man are what defile him." And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. So again, the disciples ask for extra information inside, and Jesus gives more information. He says, "Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a man from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart but his stomach, and so passes on?" Do you remember when we read Leviticus? I commented on those Jewish kosher practices. No, we talked about blood, but also talked about you can't eat meat from animals that do not chew the cud and have split hooves. Therefore, no pork. No shellfish, only fish with fins and scales. You don't eat meat and milk on the same day. You can have a meat day or a milk day. You get to decide, but you don't blend them together. So you can't find a cheeseburger in Israel among Jewish neighborhoods anyway. But so Jesus is commenting about this, saying, I don't worry about those things. It's not what goes into your mouth, but what comes out that renders a man unclean. The end of verse 19 is another parenthetical comment. It's not Jesus talking, it is the evangelist, Mark. Thus he declared all foods clean. Remember when we read Acts 15, the story of the council of Jerusalem? How that was a great contention. Do the Gentile converts need to become Jews and be circumcised and take on all these Jewish practices of diet? Remember, nobody raised their hand and said, hey, Jesus didn't worry about these things. Nobody said Jesus about that. No one dragged Jesus into it at all, remember? But Mark presents Jesus and being very clear that what you eat doesn't matter. It's what comes out of you that matters, okay? So there's a dialogue concerning the Pharisees and food. And then a further discourse on it through verse 23. Then follows a healing, verse 24. A lovely, lovely story. There he arose and went away to the region of Sidon and Tyre. Okay, now if I go back to my little crude drawing here. Okay, so that's Israel, and up here is the country, modern country of Lebanon. And here's where Tyre and Sidon are, okay? Both on the coast. This is Gentile territory again, okay? So Jesus leaves. The areas of Jewish population are Galilee and Judea, and in the middle here is Samaria, which doesn't figure much in Mark's gospel. In any case, Jesus is up here on vacation or something, and he is met by a woman who recognizes who he is, who knows something about him, who has a girl who is ill. Verse 25. Immediately a woman again, Mark's favorite connector, immediately a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by birth. Well, of course, she lives in a Gentile country. And she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said, "Let the children first be fed. It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this saying you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed, the demon gone. Okay? So what's important about this healing is that Jesus, again, shows himself comfortable healing a Gentile. We saw him casting out legion, demons, and now he has healed a Gentile woman's daughter. Then we do it all over again. Okay, we're not going to read it all. Look at chapter 8, verse 1. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, he calls his disciples to him and said, I have compassion, give them something to eat. Look at verse 4. His disciples answered him, how can one feed these men with bread here in the desert? Now, if I had been there, and I remembered this, I would have said, hey Jesus, why don't you do for us again what you did back in chapter 6? But nobody does. That's curious. Anyway, Jesus again takes the loaves and he multiplies them and they feed the crowds. And in verse 20 it says, verse 5. How many loaves have you? And they said 7. Take them and spread them around. And then at the end of that unit, verse 8, and they ate and were satisfied, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full, and there were about 4,000 people. So not quite as many people, not quite as many leftovers, but a parallel story. Okay? Verse 10, he sent them away, and immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. Okay? So they're crossing the sea. All right? And then there's a discussion about the Pharisees. Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. He sighed deeply. You know what that's like as a parent when your children aren't getting something. You go, okay, Jesus is at the edge. The Pharisees are picking at him. They want a sign. They want proof. And he says, no sign will be given you. And then he gets into the boat again. And verse 14. So we had a little dialogue with the Pharisees. Then he gets back on the boat. And it says in verse 14, now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. He cautioned them, saying, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Leaven, yeast, you know it. It's our little friend, usually, in bread. Not always a friend in some situations. But Jesus uses the image of yeast as a warning. A little bit of yeast in a big pile of wet flour causes it all to expand. You know, during the week of unleavened bread, Passover, I'm recording this during Easter week, it's still within the week of Passover, Jewish Passover. Jews do not eat any leaven. Any leavened product has to be removed from the house for the week. Because the disciples, they ate unleavened bread when they escaped from Egypt, and that's to continue for the whole week. So while yeast is usually a good thing in foods, during 1 week, it's not a good thing. Similarly, Jesus uses this image of yeast, likens it to the teaching of the Pharisees, and he warns his disciples, don't let even a little of their teaching into your head, because like yeast, it will take over. But the disciples, well, Jesus is up here talking about his teaching. They're down here thinking about their stomachs. Because that's why Mark helped us recognize in verse 14, they only had 1 loaf of bread. Okay? So, the disciples are worried about their eating. Verse 16, they discussed it with one another. Not what Jesus is talking about, the teaching of the Pharisees, but they're hungry. Being aware of it, Jesus said to them, why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? And here comes a series of questions. And these questions show Jesus' frustration and the disciples' lack of awareness about Jesus. Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Have you eyes but do not see? This is an exact quote from chapter 4, verses 10 through 12, when Jesus was talking about the slowness of the crowds, but now he's using it against his disciples. Have Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces there were? And they said, it's 12. And the 7 for the 4,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said, 7. And he said to him, do you not understand? And the implied answer is no, they don't understand. Remember how I said at the beginning in chapter 1, the disciples that Jesus calls seem so bright, so on target. They drop everything and follow. But now you've seen, beginning with as he calls them in chapter 3, in chapter 4, when they don't understand the parables, when they are worried when he's asleep in the boat, when the second time when he walks on water and they are scared, and now here that they're not understanding him. Okay? You might have a great devotion to the apostles, but in Mark's mind, the disciples are thick as cement blocks. They're not getting the truth of Jesus. They kind of get him, but they kind of don't get him. So that's this piece here, discourse on food and defilement. And then, like there was back in chapter 7, there's a healing story. Chapter 8:22. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands upon him, he asked, do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see men, but they look like trees walking. Then again he laid his hands upon his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored and saw everything clearly. And he said, do not even enter the village. Okay, there's this unique story of the healing of a blind man. It took 2 doses of Jesus before the man could see. There's going to be a second blind man story in chapter 10. You know it. It's the story of Bartimaeus. He's the one begging by the side of the road, and somehow he knows who Jesus is. He cries out, Son of David, have mercy on me. And though the crowd tries to hold him back, Jesus calls him forward. He heals the man, and the man wants to follow him, and he does follow him up the road. This incident takes place in Jericho, and Jesus goes up the mountain, up the hills now to Jerusalem. The next scene at the end of chapter 10 is the entrance into Jerusalem. We call it Palm Sunday. Bartimaeus is joining the crowd with Jesus on the way up the road. We have 2 blind men then. One blind man, not so much a good example, because it takes 2 doses of Jesus for him to get his sight. And then the blind man who already has a kind of sight, and Jesus heals him, and he follows Jesus up the road. What is Mark doing? You got it, friends. He's building a frame. But before I go into that, I want to go back to these 2 series. So from chapter 6:31 to 7:37, Mark has a series of incidents: a feeding, a water crossing, a dialogue with the Pharisees, a discourse on food and defilement, and a healing. And then in chapter 8, the same series repeats itself. Why? Well, you could say because Jesus did it twice. Well, that's a possibility. But Mark doesn't do things just because this is how it happened. He's trying to teach us something. If you paid attention to the geography, you'll recognize that these incidents, most of them take place on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. And these happen on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. Mark doesn't have any clear statements of Jesus telling the disciples, go out to all nations, baptize Gentiles, don't worry about them learning the Jewish law, just welcome them in. But what he makes the point by showing Jesus doing among the Gentiles what he did among the Jews. Remember again, Acts 15, nobody says Jesus gave us permission, he told us to do this. No, but Mark handles the same question. Not by quoting Jesus telling them to do this, but by having Jesus himself do it. What Jesus does among the Jews, he also does among the Gentiles. That's how Mark handles that question. And again, I said earlier, back in chapter 7, Mark's congregation is likely not all Jewish. So they're going to catch this and they're going to love it. Back to the story of the man who needs 2 doses of Jesus to get better. This little story is an emblem of the disciples. Yes, they left everything to follow Jesus, but they didn't understand who Jesus really was. They didn't understand what his purpose was, as we're going to see now in the last half of the gospel. That's why this bitter questioning of Jesus, of the disciples by Jesus, do you not understand? This is the exact middle of the gospel. Up until this point, Jesus has been healing people and teaching and wowing people, and the crowds have followed him. But beginning from here on out, there's only one healing story. Just one. And the crowd's going to disappear, and Jesus changes his tune. He starts talking about suffering. And that's where my next little display here, that's where this comes into play. Okay? What you have here is, again, Mark has prepared a very careful series. 3 times Jesus will predict his passion. 8:30:32, 9:31, 10:32:34. Each time he does that, his disciples show confusion and misunderstanding. 8:32, 9:33:34, 10:35:39. Because they show confusion, Jesus has to sit them down and give further teaching. 8:34:35, 9:35, 10:42:46. And at the end of this, guess what comes? Bartimaeus, the other blind man's story. Okay? So Mark has erected this big frame, and he plops this in. And this is the first series of things that happen after Jesus scolds the disciples for their failure to understand. Here is the part of Jesus that the disciples didn't understand. They signed up for Jesus who made their life easier. Many of us are attracted to religion because it's going to help us, because it's going to keep the demons away. It's going to keep us free from sickness. It's going to make our children behave, make our stocks go up. Many of us come to religion for the good things that we think we get from God through it. And Jesus is going to tell them over and over and over again, no, that's not the Messiah I am. This is not what I came. People come to religion, Christianity, thinking that Jesus is going to make their life easier. Well, I propose to you that with Jesus, you discover you've got problems you didn't know you have. Really quickly, let's look at this. 8:30:32. This is the famous scene where Jesus asks, who do people say that I am? In verse 29, he asks the question. Peter answers, you are the Christ. Ding, 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 ding. You are the Messiah. Peter should get some credit. Now in Matthew's gospel, he does get some credit, but not in Mark. No sooner does Jesus hear Peter say that you are the Christ than verse 31, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and after 3 days rise again. Peter, so that's this unit here. Peter, it says, took him aside and began to rebuke him, began to ream him out. What are you talking about, Jesus? You're the Messiah. You're Napoleon. You're going to become king of the world. You're going to put the Romans down and the Jews up. Verse 34. And he called to him the multitude. First, he says in verse 33, he says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. Again, Satan is the one who tries to mislead people from doing God's will. Jesus accuses Simon of being a tool of Satan. Get behind me. You are not on the side of God, but of men. And then he calls the multitude with his disciples and says, if any man would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. So here you have Jesus' passion prediction. Peter shows that he's thinking that Jesus is going to be king of the world. Jesus says, no, I've come to give my life. And you who would follow me should do the same. There follows after that the transfiguration and the healing. I promise there's a healing. We won't read it, we don't have time for it. But then in verse 33, verse 30, the second unit, 31. They went up from there and passed through Galilee. He was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man will be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. So the exact same prediction. Verse 32. They did not understand the saying. They did not understand. They were afraid to ask. Okay, that's this unit here. Then they come to Capernaum, and he says, what were you discussing? Jesus has just laid out his future. I'm going to die. And maybe he was hoping they'd be talking about that. But they have to admit that they were discussing, verse 34, who was the greatest? Who was the teacher's pet? Who was number 2? Who is his best buddy? So you can, again, Jesus makes a big sigh, probably. And verse 35 comes his second further teaching. If anyone should be first, he must be last of all, servant of all. He took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me. I talked about this in the very first class, how necessary it is for us to understand the ancient world, for it is, and not to bring our own agenda. Jesus puts a child in the midst of his disciples, not because he loves children. Our culture, we love our children. We dress them up like us, mini me's. And when I was raised, if the bus driver or the teacher had a report about my parents' children, my parents took the adult side. That generation, that age, understood that adults are on one team, children on another. It's very different now, isn't it? We kind of adore our children. Jesus didn't come from a culture that adored children. He points out a child because children are dependent. They don't have any money. They don't have any reputation. They got nothing to give you. A child stands for the bottom rung. Now, I would guess that the way our culture idolizes children, if Jesus were with us today, he would pick somebody else as an example in his message here. He might take a drug addict, somebody in prison, a child abuser. Huh? Think of the people that our culture reads as of no account. Jesus says greatness is service for people like that. Okay? Again, second passion prediction, second time the disciples show they're not paying attention, second time Jesus has to instruct them. And it happens again in chapter 10, verse 32. This time, James and John, part of the first quartet that Jesus called by the sea back in chapter 1, they come up to him and say, Master, do us a favor. And what's the favor? Huh? We want to be at your left and right side when you come into your kingdom. We want to be vice president and secretary of state when you become king of the world. Again, I forgot to read verse 32-34 is Jesus' third prediction. Then comes the episode where James and John step forward, and they want Jesus to give them an office when he becomes king of the world. Jesus says, are you able to drink the cup? That is, in an era before our milk, I love milk. Milk is pasteurized and homogenized, so it's all blended together. In the ancient world, too, you poured a cup. The light, sweet stuff comes to the top, and the pits and the sticks and the crap goes to the bottom. There's a word for that. It's the dregs. The dregs. And Jesus says, can you drink the cup, the whole of it? And they say, yes. He said, you don't even know what you're asking. But then he sits them down again and gives them further instruction. You know that those who are supposed to rule over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man also came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Look at the next verse. They came to Jericho, and that's where they meet the blind man Bartimaeus. I hope you see this. Mark, I told you, Mark's Greek is very simple. It's obviously a second language for him. One that he's not a great literary writer, a great author as far as style, but he's a wonderful theologian. He has created this window with the story of the two blind men, the one blind man who gets healed in stages, the other blind man, Bartimaeus, again we won't read it, but he follows Jesus up the road to Jerusalem. And then in the middle, he plants these triple predictions of Jesus' passion. Here's the kind of Messiah Jesus is. He didn't come to be king of the world, to drive a caddy and play golf and eat caviar and have young, beautiful things on his arm dressed in fur and in diamonds. No, he came to give himself to death. And he's got an idea that there's something in line of that for you and me too. I told you, many people sign up for religion because they think God's going to make their life easier. I would propose to you that if you sign up for Jesus, as Mark sees it, you're going to discover problems you never thought you had before. This is really important. This would make an excellent question on the exam. Explain what Mark is doing in chapters 8, 9, and 10. It's the very center of the gospel. It's the very core of what Mark is trying to present in Jesus. Just a few minutes and then we'll take a break. Look at chapter 11 and you see we're in Jerusalem. This begins what we know as Holy Week. Chapter 11 starts with Jesus' entrance into the city. Okay? And so up to this point, there's been very few references to time. We don't know what season of the year it is, what month, what day of the week it is. But suddenly, the story will slow down. And the narrator will give us lots of timestamps. This happened on the first day. This happened on the second day. Because from chapter 11 through chapter 16, so there's going to be 6 chapters about Jesus' last week. The previous 10 chapters, we don't know how long they took. Mark doesn't give us any sense. From John's gospel, we get the idea that Jesus had a mission of a ministry of 2 or even 3 years. We don't know what Mark thought, and Mark doesn't give us any clues to help us understand. But my point is, this last week, as we just celebrated it, our Holy Week, is really important for Mark. Jesus enters Jerusalem with a crowd. Okay, look at verse 11. He entered Jerusalem and went into the temple, and when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. That's day 1. Okay, the palm procession, Jesus looks around the temple, and he leaves. Verse 11 of chapter 11. That's day 2. Verse 12. On the following day, that's Monday, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry, and seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. Now that's a very un-Jesus-like moment, huh? It's spring. Jesus is about to celebrate Passover. So it's March or early April. And anybody knows you don't pick apples in April. You don't pick figs in April. The trees have to flower, and then the fruit develops, and in the fall, August, September, October. So Jesus is just being crazy, expecting that he's going to find figs on the fig tree. And he curses it when it doesn't provide anything for him. Jesus is being irrational, if you ask me. But Mark is doing something with that. He's not just showing Jesus on a bad day. Verse 12, is followed by verse 15. They came to Jerusalem, he entered the temple, began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he taught and said, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? You have made it a den of robbers." The chief priests and the scribes heard it and sought a way to destroy him, for they feared him. So, this is the famous cleansing of the temple. The way you've heard it preached, and think about it, is those nasty priests, they charged too much, and they gouged people, and they made the temple kind of like, a church during the parish picnic where they're selling stuff here and there. No. Mark is not concerned about, maybe he is concerned about priests who are ripping people off. But his real concern in this story is, what is Jesus doing? He's not really purifying the temple. He's shutting the temple down. I want you to think about that. Jesus' demonstration here is to shut the temple down. He will, if you can't change money, you can't, because again, Roman money had the emperor's face on it and pagan goddesses on it. You couldn't use that to buy an animal for sacrifice. So you needed the money changers. They were doing a necessary duty. And there are animals in the courtyard of the temple because, you can drag your little lamb from Galilee over the hills and dales. If they get sick or mangy or break a leg, the priest isn't going to let you offer that to God. So they're doing you a service, letting you buy, for a little markup, the sacrificial animal that's already gotten the good housekeeping seal of approval. So this is the necessary business of the business side of the temple. And Jesus shuts it down. He lets no one carry anything through the area. He's closing the temple down. What's the temple again? Temple is the place where God has agreed to meet his people in mercy and forgiveness. Jesus is making a point. Where is the nexus? Where is ground zero where we meet God and we're shown his mercy? Jesus himself. Okay? Just then follow one more thing. Verse 20. It's the next day. It's now Tuesday. They passed by in the morning. They saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said, "Master, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered." Now, from here, Jesus gives a little homilette about faith and prayer. But I want you to think this strange episode of the fig tree that didn't bear fruit in April, and then Jesus curses it, and now it's dead and dry. What is that about? Remember Mark's technique? What does Mark do? He takes a story, divides it in two, and plops another story in between. We saw that with Jairus' daughter and the woman with the 12-year bleed back in chapter 5, remember? We saw it in chapters 8, 9, and 10 with the two blind men stories. And then Mark puts in the middle these triple announcements of Jesus' death. We see it again. Fig tree, not bearing fruit. Jesus curses it. Fig tree, dried and withered. What's in between? The temple. How is the temple like a fruitless fig tree? It's beautiful. It's luxuriant. It's so attractive. It's like nursery stock. You know how beautiful those things are when you pick them up. But it's fruitless. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. The temple is not having the impact Jesus expects, God expects it to have. So Jesus is condemning the temple, thus shutting it down. Big episode at the beginning of what we call Holy Week. And little wonder that by the end of it, Jesus is going to be on a cross. Okay? Take a break. We'll be right back.